بهم يا ربنا يسر لنا أمورنا واكشف لنا كروبنا والطف بنا والمسلمين.
Yeah, where I think it's so beautiful to see the amount of support that you can get from all these different institutions to kind of form a real wholesome human being. I love that.
And that's subhanAllah, and that's been a key point for me. Also, when I've been thinking about these things and teaching these things, to bring all of this conversation back to how does Islamic community facilitate human flourishing? Because this is not something we're arguing that's just, good for Muslims, although obviously, we're talking about Muslims and Islam, but it's also something that just human beings need in general. They need tight-knit community. They need institutions that will teach them about and train them in noble character traits. They need family and extended. All of these things are human goods that are really important for flourishing, not only for Muslims, but also for non-Muslims. And I've tried to always frame it, in terms of that when I've been in settings where I'm talking to Muslims, really trying to make them understand that I'm not here just to enumerate and list a set of institutions you need, but really here to talk about institutions that are vital to your happiness, well-being, flourishing. So for me, it's a central question, Islamic community. What is it? And that's why I said, even, what was the catalyst for me thinking in a more focused way about Islamic community was just thinking about essentials today. What do people know? And this, for me, is one of the most important things. I don't believe we can flourish as Muslims, especially in such a challenging environment in the West. That's obviously very materialistic. There's not much of an emphasis on noble character traits. All of that has been devalued. Hedonistic. There's a breakdown, dismantling of, the family. In order to sort of, survive, let alone flourish, we're going to need this type of Islamic community. You could, as an individual, possibly weather the storm, push against the tide, and some people can still do it. We know even, just the Quran talks about Prophet Ibrahim as, being an ummah in himself, that he was that strong, in his faith, that he could thrive no matter what the circumstances were, whether he was, sort of in Mesopotamia, in that area where his people are overwhelmingly, they've become idol worshippers, so on and so forth. But the majority of people, and we see this in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, some people are going to need Islamic community. This is the whole purpose of the hijrah and so on.
Something that, I'm going to go a bit off track because I'm really interested to ask you a particular question, Sheikh. So these institutions make a lot of sense to someone who's grown up in it. Or even, let's say for us, we have family who grew up in, so my parents are from Sri Lanka, and sort of my mom is from Gaul, and in the fort, you may have heard they're very passionate about their tasawwuf. They have the Shadali Zawiyas and so on and so forth. It's familiar to me, which makes me lean into it a bit more. But how can someone who's not familiar with these sort of institutions feel like they can trust it when they've not heard so much about it? Because if you don't hear if you grow up in an environment where you don't hear about this, it's a bit ajib, it's a bit not sure about it. What do you think?
Yeah, and it's a bit of an issue because there is a general unfamiliarity amongst most Muslims nowadays with many of these institutions. I think sort of the first thing that needs to be done and where the onus and responsibility needs to be is firstly on the scholars, local scholars. Like I think local scholars who, and I think the majority would know about this, need to be a lot more vocal about these types of institutions, that these are normative institutions. We can talk again, like I said, about Islam in terms of practices. You need to give, you need to learn, but what are the institutions in which this was happening historically? What were the institutions that was facilitating this? Scholars, I think, need to be local teachers, need to be a lot more clear in raising awareness. So hopefully it becomes something that as people are growing up, they're hearing a lot more about. It's not as strange to their ears as Zawiya. What's a Zawiya? So I think the first thing, there's like the onus for there to be sort of a campaign or awareness campaign where we sort of say to people, look, this is what an Islamic community is. And that's what I've tried to do, for example, through some of the courses that I teach, some of the curriculum I do in Islamic schools, is to sort of say, look, develop an awareness of just what was an Islamic community historically. And then I think, in terms of trust, I'm not really sure what else you can do beyond that, beyond really making clear that it's normative. But I think we just need to, be speaking to families, to outreaching, involved in outreach to individuals, just to come and participate. That doesn't, coming to, sending your kids to this madrasa or coming to a gathering in this Zawiya, we're not looking for any type of commitment, ongoing commitment, but just come and visit and sort of see the types of things that we're doing. And hopefully with that, some level of trust can be built up. But I would say, for anyone maybe who hears these things and then hasn't heard of these things, just go out and research. Do your own simple research, whether these things were your normal conventional fixtures in Islamic societies or not. In the end of the day, it comes back to knowledge and looking into these things. If you don't trust others, look into it yourself. And I think if they look, just even a little bit into the issue, different cultures, Islamic cultures and histories, whether it's of Cairo or of Islam, wherever they're from, they can even look at their own, if they're Muslims, born into Muslim families from Muslim world, just look into your own local region where your parents came from, like you said, and what was there. Then, of course, some things will need to be addressed that, can be catalysts for distrust, maybe people have certain negative perceptions about a particular institution because what they've heard about that institution is that it involves itself in certain practices that are problematic or are unorthodox. That requires, I think, people just to, look into that and sort of, are those practices really a part of that institution or not?
Jazakallah khair. If you don't mind, I'll go back on track. Jazakallah khair.
What was yours?
What you've described before is, in terms of the different institutions, is that in any way related to what the scholar Al-Mawardi laid out in terms of the ideal community and what that looks like?
Yeah. So when I looked into this institution, in a lot more of a focused way, of course, the first source that I looked to tap into was scholarly writings. So it wasn't sort of an inductive process of sort of just looking at what was out there, at history, and then trying to,
something.
And try to distill, something that has never been articulated. No, we can find particular individuals, and also, so for example, like Imam Al-Mawardi or Ibn Khaldun, particular individuals, and we can find particular genres of scholarship, like the genre of al-akhlaq and tadbir al-manzil and tadbir al-Madina, good management of the domestic, good management of the community. We can find not only individuals, but we can also find scholarship, genres of scholarship that have dealt with Islamic community. So you take as an example Imam Mawardi, the famous Shafi'i, jurist. He's more known for his work Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniya, related to the political institution of the Khilafah. But he has another work, Adab ad-Din wa Dunya, the adab of religion and dunya. And in this book, in one of the, in the first section, I believe, of the book, he talks about the concept of salah ad-dunya, of worldly well-being. So there's salah al-akhirah, which we know, other worldly well-being, which is, inshallah, we pass, the accounting that we're going to be subjected to. May Allah make it easy for all of us. And we pass over the bridge that stretches over hell. And inshallah, we meet the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the Khaldun, and we enter into Al-Firdaus. But he talks about salah ad-dunya, which was an important question, worldly well-being. And in his book, he sort of talks about 6 or 7 principles that are vital. And what he's talking about really here is he's talking about Islamic community. He's talking about Islamic Medinas and what are the types of things that need to be present in order for there to be worldly well-being. So he mentions things like, amnun am. There needs to be widespread security. Physical security, so on, so in the city. And he talks about khisbud dar, that there needs to be sufficient wealth. And he talks about sultanun qahir, a strong local government, and he talks about dinun muttaba, that there needs to be religion that's followed. So what he's really doing through these different principles is to say that if you want an Islamic community that's thriving and flowing, you need to see these types of elements,
right? As in benchmarks, like
principles being embodied. So you've got someone like Imam Mawardi that I think talks about it in terms of those types of general principles. Then you've got someone like Ibn Khaldun who talks about it, I think, in a far more sociological way in terms of the institutions. Just what are the institutions that you should see? What are the different, even Ibn Khaldun really starts the conversation, even though his whole book is about Umran, is about settlement and about populating an area. It's about community. He starts his book with just the ulum. What are the types of sciences that need to be available in a city? But then you've got like I said, the scholarly genre of what's usually titled just ethics, al-akhlaq, but dealt with 3 separate things. And these 3 things were seen as vital to a thriving community. Firstly, akhlaq. Everyone in the community needs to know what the virtues and vices are, and they need to embody them. Then you have tadbirul manzil, good management of the domestic. So here they might talk about the household and the neighborhood and what you need to see. And then you have Tadbirul Madina, the 3rd level, which was good management of the wider city community. So here you might find the discussions of, what are the different types of professionals, and, things that we might need. So, I mean, when I sort of looked into this, the first point of contact and, the initial inspiration was from scholars that had talked very clearly, explicitly on this institution, on this this issue. Then you can look. I looked at things like social histories. There's a lot of studies just done. Even in the tarajim, biographies in our tradition, books of history just done on Kufa and Istanbul, and you can sort of see through those histories, what it is, patterns across history, what Islamic communities are. And then it was my own experience, living in different types of Islamic communities in the Muslim world, predominantly in Morocco.
Interesting. On those 3 levels that you just mentioned, so you mentioned akhlaq, tadbir al-manzil, and tadbir Medina, right? So if you could say virtues and management of the dwelling and management of the state.
Yeah.
Now, if we were to say, like, if we could say that these three items are important, vital aspects that will indicate whether a society is doing, whether it's doing well. So you look at these three aspects to see. In today's society, do you think it's possible that we could look at one of these aspects and see or say that, okay, society today is lacking in this aspect? And even in your experience, which aspect do you think is lacking out of these three? If that's possible to say, you reckon?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like, I think there's a lack. There's deficits in all of those three levels. And you could really sort of make arguments either way for whether, the greatest, sort of absence or privation or lack is in the family or is in, the wider community. But, I think...
They're linked, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's also important. It's difficult to sort of give a clear answer. But I mean, I think, the idea of that literature also was really the bedrock is akhlaq.
Right.
If you don't have a culture in which people are actively trying to eliminate their vices, trying to acquire the virtues, that is not only going to reflect negatively on the individual level, on the level of persons, but it's going to have ramifications in the family. It's going to have ramifications in the wider community, in the workplace, or whatever. So I think, it becomes then very important to really focus on that virtue aspect and the virtue institutions. And although I think, we do have masjids, we do have, madrasas and kutab, we do have, Islamic schools, and we do have some zawiyas. I would say that, and, everyone could sort of ask themselves this question, thinking about them, the people around them. When I think about Muslims and what they think of Islam, I still don't think Muslims think about Islam and what's most important to Islam in terms of noble akhlaq and acquiring them. Like, if you were to ask a Muslim, what's the most important thing, sort of in Islam, they might say prayer, and yes, it's very important, and that's what we should be doing, and knowing let's just say our basic aqeedah, and that's very important. But noble character, and the idea that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was sent in order to complete, a good character. I don't think that is still clear in the minds of most Muslims. I think they sort of think that, if I know my basic aqeedah and I pray, that's sufficient. Whereas, we know from our tradition that a person can pray, and then if they're harmful to their neighbors, they can still be going to hell, in the famous hadith, or if they pray, but, they do something like, cage a kitten until that without giving it food, that can be enough to put them in hell. So for me, I think about it in terms trying to answer that answer. It's a problem for me if most people can't articulate that a central part of Islam is developing their akhlaq. So then we've got a massive problem here, if people just don't understand that principle. But then it's a just as large a problem if the institutions that are meant to help them to develop that akhlaq are also either absent or insufficient. And that's why I'd probably say the first level, alhamdulillah, there is a growing awareness, in quarters about the importance of this lifelong, sort of activity and goal of trying to perfect your character. There is a growing awareness, and there are some institutions that now, alhamdulillah, have grown, and that have been around also for a while, other ones, but it's still too insufficient to be able for us to say, alhamdulillah, at least this level of virtue formation, is heading in the right direction. I don't think we're sort of there yet. And like I said, if that is the foundation and that's not in order, then you're going to see the problems
cascading.
They're going to show up in the family level, and they're going to show up in the workplace level, and they're going to show up in leadership, at the top.
It's trickle, it's a trickle upward effect.
Exactly.
Effect.
Exactly. If there's no virtue, everything will be corrupted in the end and dysfunctional. Also, but I would say if I did speak at the family level and also the wider community management of there's also like catastrophic problems in these, just even how we understand what family is, also, in terms of, our work, the type of work we get involved with, and, how we conduct ourselves. But the virtue I'd probably say is the most problematic.
It's like
worrying.
Having a structured approach to your life starting from the heart, and that sort of permeates into like your family, as you were saying. And if that's good, then the community is good, and if that's good, everything else seems to be in a balanced and harmonious way. You mentioned the masjid, you mentioned the jami, and you mentioned the Zawiya. If, let's say, any of these were missing from a society, what do you sort of see as the effects in a community?
I mean, like, it comes back to understanding what a masjid is meant to do, the different functions it's meant to, be facilitating. When we go back to the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see it was doing a lot of things. There was teaching, obviously, of ilm, teaching people their, basics of prayer. The Prophet Muhammad is modeling wudu, he's modeling prayer, and there's it's a forum also for the community, knowing who's vulnerable, who's in need, and distributing wealth. It's a place of, obviously, for the community to gather on Fridays. There was a lot of, it was even in that time, it was a place, where even sometimes adjudication and these type of functions took place. But one of the most important things that the masjid was doing in the time of the Prophet Muhammad was this practice of tazkiya. And it's mentioned in the Quran, a couple of times, liyuzakkihim, that Prophet Muhammad has been sent, to deliver the signs, the book, wisdom, and to purify them. And one of the things that the Prophet Muhammad was doing in that masjid was he was guiding the Sahaba in a very individual, personalized way, to be ready for death, to be ready for their meeting with Allah, to develop, praiseworthy character traits. Like scholars, when they talk about, the hadiths related to the Prophet Muhammad talking about what are the most beloved of actions to God, they make the observation that Prophet Muhammad is giving different answers. Sometimes he's saying that it's belief in, God and the next world. Sometimes he's saying praying on time, early in time. And so scholars, when they sort of do jami, when they try to reconcile between those disparities, what some of the muhaqqiqun, the experts have said is that he was giving the answer based on the person in front of him. So this person maybe was somebody who was a bit lax in their prayer. Maybe if he delayed it, he tended to sort of, possibly not. So he's saying to that person, pray at the start of the time. That's the most beloved action in the sight of God for that person. So you get a sense just of, what we read about the seerah, but also what we see in the hadiths, and that the Prophet Muhammad was doing this. He was doing this tazkiya in a very personal way. After the time of the Prophet Muhammad because his masjid was not only doing the function of a neighborhood masjid, but a greater masjid with their ilm, with a jami at the Friday prayer, and also what came to the Zawiya to do, which is also the tazkiya. When these functions were separated out after, some of those functions later on, you saw them being done in a neighborhood masjid, and you saw others being done in a greater masjid, and you saw others being done in the jami, and you saw probably one of the most important functions of tazkiya being done in what came to be called the Zawiya or the Khaniqah, or there was a lot of names, tazkiya given to it. So sort of to come back to what you're asking, if I remember correctly, was if there was something missing, which would be, was that the question?
Yeah, like so you've described it as all of these different functions happening initially in the masjid, and then later on spreading into these different sort of institutions. But if any of them were missing, what would the effect of society be?
So I mean, if any of them were missing, there would be a dysfunctional consequence. There would be serious consequences for society if you didn't have a place where people could come and study their ilm, or access a mufti, or access adjudication,
that spiritual guidance.
Yes, seek spiritual guidance. That would be a problem. But there's some that would be more problematic if they were absent than the others, although they're all equally as important. And really, the most important one would be if an institution that is meant to provide us with that tazkiya was absent. Because like we said, going back to what we're saying, if the foundation is rotten, you don't have a community with people who are actively trying to acquire the virtues, then you're going to see problems. It's just going to become a systems problem. It's just going to spread to everywhere. So, that the most problematic one, and I think even sort of today's, reality points to it, is the fact that we don't have those institutions, like I said, historically, that were done through the Zawiya, but could be done in a masjid again. But those individuals and those practices and that environment that really helps people to transform themselves, and so then be a better family member, be a better, contributor in wider society, stand up for justice, so on and so forth.
SubhanAllah, even I think most Sufis and scholars or people involved in tazkiya, you could honestly probably just boil down tazkiya or tasawwuf or zuhud or whatever you want to call it to adab and akhlaq, right?
Yeah.
So, and then you were saying something like in how akhlaq, adab is the most virtual part of society. That's 100% true. And I think a part of the problem of why we are missing that in society as well is because I know for me growing up, for example, when you're taught, akhlaq at school, you're just taught manners. Akhlaq is to say please and thank you.
Yeah.
Akhlaq is, just be polite to this person.
Yeah.
And you think, okay, as long as I've got good manners, I pray and I'm good to my parents, that's it. There's nothing else.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've already sort of got a lot going against us in terms of how we understand character. Like, Sidi Abdurrahman was just saying, we live in sort of liberal societies, and in liberal societies are characterized by what sociologists and political theorists refer to as having a thin ethics. Ethics is in liberal languages, don't harm others, and you can sort of just do whatever you want.
The harm principle.
The harm principle. So you've got that already that's problematic, and that culture then comes down into even the education system, where what are you really taught? Just leave aside Islamic schools, but sort of public schools. What are you really taught? In terms of akhlaq or adab? Tolerate others, respect their opinions. Maybe you're taught about honesty, and you need to be truthful. But that thick type of ethics, where you're really trying to develop the entire panorama of akhlaq, generosity, patience, courage, tawakkul. It's not something that you're going to get in today's society, whether it's in school, and a lot could be said on this topic, and there's a reason, I'm saying that you don't see that in liberal society, precisely because they've got this thin ethics, they've got this idea of, that, atomized individualistic society, or just individuals and just pursue your own immediate interest, and that's usually, of course, material interest, so you've got that, issue, you've got that society that sort of doesn't provide us the type of environment we need to do that most important thing. And then the problem is, within that society, you don't really have an Islamic community that's built the sufficient institutions to support. So let's say hypothetically we weren't getting that in schools, or our kids weren't getting in that at schools. You would hope that we have a layer of community, that at least that they can come into and learn that type of stuff. But really, we don't. The most we have is sort of masjids with motivational talkers, who sort of inspire you maybe to on one night do one act of great generosity for a fundraiser. But going back to what we said originally about tasawwuf is really about, and tazkiya is about habits, building within you those habits, not just a one-off act of generosity, but what is the type of environment that can do that? It's not the masjid where you're just going to hear an inspirational speaker. So it's the dhikr circles, it's the suhbah, it's the wird, the routines that you build at home. That's the type of environment you embed yourself in that creates the soil for those habits and those character traits.
Real training ground.
Shaykh, you're talking about slow growth, am I right? Like having the right environment, the right soil, the right nutrition. What if someone is in triage? What if they come and say, look, man, like my son's not even praying his 5 prayers, and you want to tell me about akhlaq? How do we approach that? Because you might find, I know we were talking earlier about, maybe it's not representative of society generally, but people find themselves in this situation. What is the presentation to them?
Yeah, I mean, that sort of, it comes back to, what I've been saying, that, ideally, sort of hopefully what you would have is the masjid system with the different types of masjids. And hopefully what you would have over time, whether that's because of the family that is encouraging, that family member, or just, the scholars who are making it clear to that person what an Islamic community involves. But hopefully you would have a person who's going to the masjid, who's making contact with a Zawiya, who's getting these different experiences. So, maybe they're not quite ready for the Zawiya in that sense of the Zawiya, but they're also at least in touch with maybe other elements in the masjid system, the neighborhood masjid, where they're hearing just general admonitions. But what I would sort of say, also is a lot of the times people have this concept of the Zawiya being this place only where that type of intense spiritual training takes place. And it's really not that. That is part of the Zawiya, and that is what the Zawiya offers that no other place offers. But Zawiyas have also been places that just accommodate, sort of popular piety, just come along and just become, part of a gathering where we're going to do some light dhikr, and pray and a light admonition. So, I mean, for the person, that hypothetical individual who might say, he's just trying to, learn how to pray and build the practice of praying, and, this stuff is too. I would say that the visceral experience of the Zawiya is not a place where you come in, they're just like, okay, now you're going into like boot camp.
Yeah.
And here's your wird, and here's a tasbih with 1,000 beats. You know,
with the 10, so 10,000.
and around the neck. That's not what.
Here's a meal. I'll see you in 3 hours.
See you in 40 days.
I mean, even like what, for example, when I've visited Shaykh Abdul Rahman's, Hafidullah, his Zawiya, it's been a place where there's a little talk about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Right.
You know, there's a little tadhkir, there's food, and really that I would say for that person, you know, who's struggling even just to get their prayer, that's the most important thing, is just to start to make contact with a righteous, well-intentioned suhbah company. Yeah, because, you know, a lot of the time these problems come back to the company of a person, you know, starting from when they're younger in schools, who they were hanging out with. It might not happen straight away, but over time there's that attrition, you know, and where maybe what that young child learnt in his family to be dutiful and to pray 5 times a day is slowly chipped away at, you know, through that company. So, I mean, it's usually company, and that company could be even just within the family. The family could have been the problem to solve, but it's usually company, inshallah, outside of family, if it's a righteous family that, you know, I mean, that in the bare minimum of just, you know, asking the children to pray and making sure they're praying. It's usually bad company outside of the family that starts a lot of these problems. It's not the type of company that will be like, okay, we're out now, but let's stop and go and pray. And usually the way back, the remedy is through company, through changing, you know, through changing company, through good suhbah. And that's what the Zawiya is. Like I said, it's not this like boot, you know, camp. It's no, when you see there's layers to, you know, the Zawiya, and the good thing about the Zawiya is, like I said, because there's those layers, maybe he can go from being that person first who's just rectifying his prayer, then to going and understanding that there's, you know, a deeper, you know, journey to be had here.
Right.
You know,
that's still a linear journey as well. People really do start at different stages, and people, do traverse at different rates. So, subhanAllah. I was going to ask a sheikh though. So, I'm going to double dip here. So, a double question. So, we spoke a lot about Zawiya, but we haven't actually discussed what was the role of Zawiya in historically and even today in modern times. And historically as well, you'd find that Zawiya would be much more widespread, ubiquitous, more than masajid even. So why was that the case? And does that, you know, like someone from the outside might hear and be like, whoa, we've got more, you know, people should go to masjid more. Why are there more Zawiya? Are you calling people away from the masjid, for example?
Yeah. So, I mean, it comes back with a couple of points we've sort of touched on. In the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all the different functions of a masjid were gathered in the one place. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is there. He's the teacher of ilm. He's the murabbi. He's the mufti. He's the, you know, the hakim, so on and so. So, you know, at least in his time, all of those different functions and activities were in the masjid. And also in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have the greatest of generations, the Sahaba, who are all very invested in this journey of trying to get ready to meet Allah, you know, try to earn his pleasure. And they understand that in terms of trying to get rid of, you know, their reprehensible character traits and, you know, sort of acquire good character traits. And that's what really the sunnah is. You know, people don't usually understand this, but the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and why we repeat it is because through repeating his sunnah, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ teaches us when you see a poor person or a vulnerable person, a widow, give them money. Through repeating that, that's how you actually start to develop that character trait of generosity. For example, you know, so those activities were all gathered in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and in the time of the Sahaba and in certain, you know, communities of the Salaf. But with time, what happened was masjids became more of a site just for popular piety, praying your 5 prayers, maybe listening to an admonition. And in terms of the Muslim population, the dynamics were changing. They weren't the Sahaba anymore. Most people are interested in that very sort of rigorous, and sometimes arduous process and training. So it's at this time where now we're seeing some of the functions that were unified in the prophetic masjid being separated out. Even adjudication. Adjudication wasn't taking place for much longer in the masjid. It was starting to be taking place in a court outside. There were still some things, that would come back and be done in the masjid, like the li'an, certain things. But most of this was being separated out. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gathering the community, doing shura with, the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, the maturest of the Sahaba, taking decisions on, policies or this. That wasn't being done in the masjid either. That had been removed out of the masjid, now into the bilat, to the palaces of the. So there was a lot of things that were separated out after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And one of the other things that was separated out, because the masjid had become really this place more for just the 5 prayers, this stuff, was this tazkiya aspect. And so what we start to see at that time is these more personal, smaller spaces of the Zawiya starting to spread across Islamic cities, where if you want a place to come now and do night prayer and to be with people who are really invested in getting rid of their reprehensible, come to this space, and it's available and it's open all the time. So it was part of a broader process of certain functions being separated out from the masjid that were unified in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and also, in terms of this particular aspect, because the masjid had become increasingly, a place, for popular piety. But, already by the time of the Salaf, you're hearing about all these famous personalities taking these separate spaces in their houses, or in other people's houses, whether they were doing these more intense, rigorous, and intimate, rigorous gatherings, staying up all night. As early as Hassan al-Basri and other famous. So I mean, the ground was already set in this time of the Salaf, where you see this. If you look into the Tarajim, you're seeing that they're not doing this stuff necessarily only in the masajid anymore, that they're spending the night, which they would have, done in the time of the Prophet Muhammad in their houses, but mainly in the masjid, spend that time in the masjid.
Because he was there.
Yeah, because he was there, and it was really the central hub. He could come at any time, and the Sahaba want to be there and stuff. This happened. The Sahaba would be gathered, and then all the time the Prophet Muhammad he comes and asks them, "Did you? All that you gathered you here was to do what you're doing now? To speak about Jannah and to so." At after the time of the Prophet
and
Muhammad,
the dhikr that happened in the masjid as well.
The dhikr, and just the greatest of the Sahaba are there and stuff like that, and it's really the one.
Where else would you be?
exactly. But after that time, like I said, as early as the Salaf, you can see all of these developments occurring, and in particular, the certain scholars, especially certain scholars known for this aspect of tazkiya, Junaid, all of these famous names, taking these more private spaces.
So that concept really existed. The concept of a Zawiya really existed in the time of the Salaf.
Yeah, in the time of the Salaf, definitely. Like in the time of the Salaf, that type of intense...
but was it called a Zawiya?
It wasn't called a Zawiya. I think it was called a Zawiya. I don't know at what point, because Zawiya refers to like a corner. That's what it means in Arabic. It takes, sort of metaphor,
of sectioned out.
of a person isolating themselves, of a person, sort of being involved in a level of withdrawal from the activities around them. So the Zawiya takes it, and it usually, scholars would sit the scholar himself, the Murabbi would sit, with his back in a Zawiya. So there's different names, but yeah, the name, like most things, tasawwuf, Zawiya, is just a name that's already naming a reality that already existed previously, but are becoming increasingly more formalized. But yeah, going back to sort of what was said, once you get past, sort of the 400th year, when you go into the old cities, sort of Baghdad, all those, you are finding a lot more zawiyas spread out.
Yeah.
They're smaller spaces, sort of than the masjids. They're more simple spaces. There could have been another reason where, like, I haven't seen studies done on this, but Ahlul Tasawwuf generally tried to move away from that type of adornment of the dunya, and masjids were being increasingly adorned and all those type of things. So it'd be interesting to look at studies of what, are the different factors that culminate.
I feel like especially the Malikis. I feel like Malikis they're really against, adorning the mosques and things like praying on a nice like rug, even with the Quran as well. The tajweed being that's the beautification of the voice. Like very like a dopamine detox method sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, there was a lot of reasons, but definitely what would be the experience. That's why I say to some people today, go and visit an Islamic city, an old Islamic city, like for example, Titwan, where I'm from in Morocco, and walk through the old city and start to take notice, the masjids versus the Zawiya, how many there are. And you start to see this trend of there being a lot more Zawiya tucked away, just because, like I said, there were those places where those type of activities could be constantly accessed.
In the Zawiya, there's a lot of there's obviously a lot of remembrance of Allah, the dhikr, the awareness of Allah, and the names of Allah, and basically a lot of introspection. Have you, and you don't have to mention anyone's names, but in people who you've taught or people you've mentored or worked with even, have you seen a transformation in someone who has been part of this environment? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this, not necessarily as a teacher, but, just being parts of different zawiyas from Morocco to Australia. But, people usually come to the Zawiya with, especially nowadays, with a sense of purpose that they're coming and they know what they're coming for, that it's a place where they're going to try and improve their character, do dhikr and stuff. But definitely what I've seen, because I've seen very, I don't want to call it extreme, but very rigorous examples of a Zawiya and more looser examples. There is a spectrum. Like I've seen places in Morocco, like when I was memorizing the Quran when I was quite young, where it's like, there's the Zawiya and there's the graveyard here, and like people are coming and they're very committed, so it's like night prayer, so you come into the Zawiya as a novice, and what you're looking for is an environment for you to start to practice in, to mimic. And so what a person comes into that type of environment, and what are they seeing? They're seeing people up at all hours of night. They're seeing dhikr circles. They're seeing people now every day going to the graveyard, crying at the graveyard, finding it after Maghrib, reading the Ihya of Ghazal, like, and definitely in
that's boot camp.
That's boot camp. Yeah. And definitely in that sort of situation. And alhamdulillah, because there's that, sort of understanding that people need to go slowly. So those people will take that novice and say, just wake up for a little bit and go back to sleep. You're not going to do what we're doing now.
Yep.
You see that change, of course, over time, where that person goes from somebody, who's probably praying and stuff, but now goes to somebody who's praying at night and, and also constantly engaged in the remembrance of death, and what's coming, and so I mean, I've seen that example, and I've seen the more loose examples, where people come and within a relatively short amount of time, and I've seen it even locally. Here's some people in MMS who've joined Shaykh Abdul Rahman's Zawiya, and then have told me about their experience after being a year or so, that it's completely changed them, because they got structure from the Zawiya, they got their wird, and over time they start to taste the meanings in those wird, and it, obviously that's what the Zawiya does. It starts, one of the key things it does is it puts you into a new routine in which you start your day off in dhikr and you end, you tend to end your day off. And just having those meanings at the start of your day, and that alone starts to transform the person. So I've seen even people, just locally in, Shaykh Abdul Rahman's, Zawiya, or spaces like YMA, that it's a bit looser, but have had elements of a Zawiya there. And even, before the Zawiya Sulukiya that I was a part of, Shaykh Abdul Hafiz's Zawiya, where definitely people come in,
Inshallah.
And over time they become a lot more prone. Dhikr becomes a part of their life, and wanting to now, you see it even in a lot of the life decisions. Maybe they went to uni and studied a particular thing, and now being in the Zawiya, and that's changed their perspective on even what they want to do. They want to go into teaching instead of being in business or something like that. So it can have all types of effects, depending especially on the age of the person when they come in, whether they're set in certain things, career decisions or study decisions. But yeah, I've seen sort of a big transformation, and the most important thing, see a Muslim where they really understand that central to their Islam is this ongoing effort to improve their akhlaq, and to improve their adab. That's really one of sort of the standards. When you can see somebody who's gone from, understanding Islam is praying this, to now it's about developing, makarimul akhlaq or masalihul akhlaq, then you can see that there's a big transformation has taken place. And then there can be signs of that in terms of where they now spend their time, the suhbah now that they're, sort of engaging with, so on and so forth.
Tabarakallah. Go back in communities now. We haven't spoken about, so we spoke about the soul first in communities now, but now how are they intertwined? Have you personally yourself been in a community where it's built around almost 100% tasawwuf, or everyone is on that same page of tasawwuf? Or if you've been exposed to those communities, and what are they like?
Yeah, I mean, like if you mean in a broader sense, like a community in a particular village or a city or something
where
like
most people are privy to tasawwuf.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen those type of places in Morocco, although even Morocco things have become a bit more, sort of watered down because of certain trends. In Morocco was never really an influence, for example, of Wahhabi Salafism. It was an influence of what we call Islahi Salafism, which was more the Salafism that was imported from Egypt. Of the Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida, and then all the people that they influenced, which was never to say that tasawwuf was un-Islamic, but basically did take the position that tasawwuf, there had been many accretions, developments that were innovations, and so they didn't have the problem that Wahhabi Salafis had, which was to say that tasawwuf is just, in principle un-Islamic. It's got nothing to do with Islam. No, these would recognize that tasawwuf is Islamic, but it had lost its path, and there was innovations and stuff like that. So Morocco has been affected by that discourse.
Like mainstream practices now have been deemed innovations, for example.
Yeah, I mean, like, no, dhikr and all that type of stuff is like still considered fine, know, and, if there's a Zawiya and it's following, sort of things that, are recognizable to people, then it's considered fine. But there's a bit more suspicion, there's a bit more caution, when it comes. And then you've got just, sort of, people that will just outright say that it's just problematic. But in general, like especially in more maybe rural places, just outside of the city, I've seen places where it didn't even really have a name, tasawwuf. Like there was like, because a lot of the time why we talk about tasawwuf is because there's that negative thing, and it's something that now we have to explicitly talk about a lot more. Whereas in a more organic, it's just part of life.
Yeah,
it's not even talked about. Like for somebody to come in and maybe even to name it tasawwuf, the normal person might not understand fully. But their whole life is built on dhikr circles and this, so they might encounter it as the threat when, there's somebody's coming and saying this sheikh is a mubtadi', then, but for the majority, like I've been in places where it's just been a part of the life world of the community, so people are, farming and they've got a wird for farming, and then, people are coming in, for their 5 prayers to the masjid, and then they're going to their, Tijani or Shadhili, sort of Zawiya, where they're doing more intense dhikr at night, and there's maybe food that's being put down for the community, and they're involved in the diyafa, the hosting activities of the local Zawiya, because a Zawiya as an institution was a lot more, especially over time, than just training noble akhlaq. There was also sort of charity, sort of services, and other types of services, even if it was for ilm and stuff. So I've been in a place where places where I've seen that completely permeate life, where awrad were a part of everything, where the local shuyukh, sort of were involved in, to varying degrees, guiding a lot of sort of the local population. And then just where the practices of tasawwuf were just, everywhere. Like I said, night prayer, dhikr, fasting, opening up books of tasawwuf and talking about it. Yeah, and definitely those are the ideals, like the virtuous society, not only amongst men but also women. So even you have the women who have their own gatherings, and
in Sri Lanka, in Galle, there's a ladies' Zawiya, and my grandfather's sister, she's like the representative there, and she's like in her bed, she's like bedridden now. She's memorized Yasin, does all these things, so people come visit her. But ladies' Zawiya,
definitely. There would be like a woman like who's muqaddima of the sheikh, and she would go and they would they read names of Allah, like Ya Latif or Ya Hay, so it was definitely and that's how it was, I think, in some places before the last 50 years in all of society, in some places, before the last 70 years, so on and so forth. But it's, there were certain events that occurred that caused, that system to start to, decrease.
In terms of the aqidah and in terms of fiqh and tasawwuf, would it be correct to say, and I've got like 2 questions, would it be correct to say that they all work hand in hand to support each other, in the sense that if someone was questioning tasawwuf as a valid science for whatever reason, would your approach to them, or maybe they even had a bad experience, like they've been burnt by something their past or something, would you approach providing the landscape to them by saying that, yeah, these sciences actually, like the fiqh, like the people who sort of provide fatwas or legal rulings and sort of manage the fiqh aspect of life and how you operate as a Muslim, do they provide like the checks and balances to make sure that your tasawwuf is within sort of what would be considered Islamic? And is that how you would reassure people?
Yeah, like I definitely would say, first of all, that all of these things are interconnected. These sciences or these bodies of knowledge, they're interconnected. Like you could take the example just of the prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Prayer is not just about the correct way to, lift your arms up and knowing the arkan, and the sunan and the fada'il that the fuqaha talk about. It's also about, having khushu', and experiencing shawq, longing for Allah, and having a sense of His azama when you go into sujood, and having that. So the fuqaha will tend to talk about prayer in terms of just the outward, the rules, that what you need to do in order to your prayer to be valid. But that's not what the prayer just is. It's probably not what even the prayer most essentially should be. It should be about you really feeling that you're worshipping Allah, that you're feeling those states of awe, and that's the job of tasawwuf there. So like, I mean, if you're going to just give an example of fiqh, the connection between fiqh and tasawwuf, you can see the two in the prayer. I've given the other example of tasawwuf with theology, that you can believe that Allah's one, okay, but Allah's oneness, and the ulama, of kalam talk about Allah's attribute of oneness. There's there's the oneness of His that. We mean that He's only one being. He's not two separate beings, or there's a daughter, and then there's the oneness, for example, of His sifat, that there's only one being that has His sifat, has His sifa of knowledge or power, and there's another sense of what that means. And then there's oneness, for example, of af'al, that Allah is really the only agent in the world. It's not the water that quenches your thirst. It's actually Allah that's quenching your thirst. That's just an outward means. That's just an aada. That usually when you drink the water, you feel like you're quenching, but the actual agent of quenching your thirst. So for a Muslim, ideally, we learn that in Aqidah in a very theoretical way. But how do you experience it? Where you really feel in an embodied way in all your life that from raising my arm to the flicker of my eye to me talking now, that Allah is the agent who's allowing that to happen. That again is through the practices of tasawwuf, through constantly remembering Allah, through constantly remembering those meanings that we find in the awrad. We start to, that really starts to permeate our perception of everything. Our worldview. It starts to, just because what you're doing is you're taking a meaning that you learn in theology, that Allah is the only doer, but then through dhikr, you're refreshing it. You're saying it constantly. And when you keep doing that refreshing, eventually it becomes something that you're familiar with.
Right.
It's no longer something theoretical, it's something embodied and something that you experience. So again, whether it's fiqh and, sort of tasawwuf and the prayer, or, theology and tasawwuf and really experiencing those beliefs, they're sort of very much interconnected, and you can't really have one without the other if you're looking to perform a complete prayer, that Allah will accept, or if you're really trying to realize something like ihsan, where you're seeing the whole world as a set of signs pointing to him.
Allah.
You're seeing him in everything, his goodness, his power, his knowledge, his oneness in everything. Yeah. What was the second part about the trust issue?
Oh, well, I guess in terms of if someone was had a bad experience with tasawwuf, or for whatever reason mistrusted the science, would you reassure them by showing them the interconnectivity to show that there's a system of checks and balances?
So I mean, the first thing we should say here, because a lot of attention has been drawn to tasawwuf when it comes to distrust or maybe what some perceive to be, or rightly so, dubious practices, is that all areas potentially and all practitioners can be affected by some type of corruption. The scholars, the main reason Imam Shatibi writes his muwafaqat about the maqasid of the Sharia is because he's saying the fuqaha in his time, some of them involved in very dubious practices, like trying to find loopholes to get people out of paying zakat. So it's the hawl is coming very soon when you need to pay zakat. It's the year is coming to an end, and I have wealth and I don't want to pay zakat. So you go to the faqih and he says to you, just go and invest it in horses or something, change the type of wealth, and you won't need to, won't need to pay now zakat. So, there's always been, now what I'm trying to sort of draw attention to is that sometimes people's distrust comes from genuinely bad experiences where maybe someone who was pretending to be a faqih, an faqih with integrity, or somebody was pretending to be a murabbi, but he's not actually a murabbi. They've gotten into that situation and they've been burnt, and left a bad it's left a bad experience with them. So what I'm trying to address first is that type of experience. And I'm saying here that, look, firstly, we need to understand, because tasawwuf has been given a lot of, sort of focus in terms of this happens everywhere. In Islamic, amongst Islamic practitioners, you can get the faqih who's suddenly saying that interest is halal, certain types of interest today. But does that then mean that we would say that all fuqaha are corrupt? That we would say that you're valid in, mistrusting the whole establishment? No one would say that. It's like, the analogy is you go to a person who you think is a doctor and they do and they're not a doctor. They're not competent. They don't have qualifications or an accountant or anything like that. And the doctor does some surgery on you, and it's, the surgery is botched and you're left with some lifelong. Are you then going to
suspect all doctors after that?
You're going to be suspicious of all doctors. No, you're not. You're actually going to, the first thing you're probably going to do is return to a good doctor to try and fix it. So it's the same with sort of in that type of experience, maybe where people have had legitimately bad experiences because there was some type of corruption. That you should understand, the first thing is that, just because this person did some bad thing, that doesn't mean you should distrust the whole system, of tasawwuf or of Sufi. So what I usually encourage, people to be mindful of is that in terms of tasawwuf in particular, and like I said again, there would be certain things that I would make people mindful of when approaching fuqaha. Watch out which fuqaha you're going to go to. These guys are just going to give you any fatwa you want, but and the same thing with tasawwuf. Now, I would usually say to them, go to a Zawiya that is recognized by local scholars. You can see local scholars or teachers visiting it, are speaking positively of it. Use that as one balance, because usually local scholars, the local scholarly community, they're connected, they network, and they understand what's going around in their local area. And they can say to you, look, this place, okay, go, but maybe go just for this, maybe do some dhikr, and that's it. There's no real bay'ah here. There's no, this is not a true murabbi. He just has barakah from his father. He's there, you know, and this place, go, here's some place, and there's knowledge here, and there's knowledgeable brothers here. So if they're trying to overcome trust, the first thing, if it's that type of trust from a legitimately bad experience, to understand that, you know, that one experience can't be taken as indicative of all of tasawwuf and practitioners, and always use your local scholarly community as a check, as a way of verifying whether a particular group, you know, there's sometimes where scholars will say to certain people, don't go to that group, or that, even though they're a legitimate tasawwuf group, don't go yet, because they're quite rigorous. You know, you need a bit more time. You know, even the murabbun themselves would sometimes turn away people. Imam Shadhili is famous for, you know, saying to people that came and want to, you know, take tarbiyah under him, go and learn your aqidah first, or go and learn your fiqh first. You know, there's, you know, those famous, you know, sort of statements in the books from the past. So yeah, definitely use your, and it's quite important, because we don't have the same type of regulatory bodies here that we would have had in traditional societies. If you go to Istanbul, for example, 200 years ago, and someone is caught giving fatwa, and he's not a mufti, he's not wearing the turban of iftar, that person is going to be in serious trouble. So society had its own checks and balances and regulatory framework. The Hisbah itself was looking into these issues. We don't have any of that here. You know, anyone, you can see it today, anyone can open up a YouTube channel, anyone can open up a local branch of something, and we don't have an apparatus around us. So what do we always fall back onto, especially in these types of contexts where there's no state, we fall back on the community of scholars, local scholars,
So
and see what the local scholars are going to advise about a particular group, or a particular Zawiya, or a particular faqih that might be saying something controversial.
Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
Let's fast forward now to 2025. Today's the 12th of
We're
April.
in 2026.
Oh my goodness.
I think you're still in last year, bro.
Sorry, I'm still back in time. Back in the Zawiya, Shaykhana, so we spoke about the roles of the Zawiya and how important it was that you've established that. Now, in today's day and age, obviously the effects on a community due to a lack of a Zawiya or a Khanaqah of these spaces, I think are quite evident. Could you probably just maybe expand on these effects, and maybe talk about why communities are suffering, how they are suffering, how the effects of not having Zawiya, how they're manifesting in communities, or basically what do they need and what are they missing?
So I think the greatest effect, I think, negative effect, is just people end up living their whole life and they don't know Allah. That is the biggest effect. You're created, and you're created with a certain set of faculties, like the intellect, and the highest object or highest existent that the intellect can know is God. The most beautiful, majestic being that the intellect can know is God. And the intellect has been created in order for you to use it to know God. And there's some people, and the same with the will, you've got this, something is good, and then usually you should incline to it. I know it's good to pray 5 prayers. I incline to it. I know there's a being out there who has all the attributes of perfection. He's free of all the attributes of deficiency. I want to please that being. But sometimes the problem is in our intellect, we don't know that being. Sometimes the problem is in our will. We know that being, but we just don't have the willpower. Maybe we're distracted, or we're attracted to other things of the dunya. We're fixated on some problem or some, person. And what can happen is we can go through our whole life and we never realize our humanity. We never know the greatest of beings. And sometimes we, even though we might know something about that being, we're not inclined to pursue his pleasure. So the Zawiya is a place that gives you an environment, that teaches you about Allah, his names, that you refresh those truths all the time, about those different divine meanings and divine attributes. And so with time, you're drawn to him as a place that allows you, like I said, gives you that environment to help you break free from the other fixations you have. Because that's the big problem, is people go out through their whole life and they're fixated on lowly things.
Yes,
maybe money or a particular career, like I said, or a particular person, or this. And their years, their time is
that Sheikh, because people think happiness is the purpose of life?
Yeah, I mean, they're not wrong to think that we should be aiming for sa'ada, but the problem is, what is the true object of happiness? That's the problem. So our scholars will talk about sa'ada fi darain, that that Sharia is taking you to happiness in this life and the next. But what is the genuine object of happiness? The problem is that people tend to think it's money.
Right.
They could think it's money, or maybe they know it's not money, but their will is weak, and so they're attached to money. The problem is the genuine object, the thing that will make us, you can call it happiness, but it's better to call it flourishing. The thing, because that's sa'ada. Happiness is more of a subjective term, whereas well-being or flourishing has elements of subjective and the objective. But the thing that our flourishing truly lies in, happiness is knowing the greatest of beings. But what happens is, over your whole life, you're fixated on something that really doesn't have, the qualities in it that should draw you so much to that thing, whether it's money or a person. So the biggest thing that you lose from not being in an environment that creates that remembrance of God, constantly brings to the forefront, to the foreground, those elevated meanings of his majesty, of his beauty, of his perfection, is that your time is ticking and your life will go past and you never know God properly, and like I said, your faculties are created in order to know that being, and in order to be inclined to that being. So that's the most devastating effect, that you do not realize your humanity. You don't realize you're fixated, like I said, on lower manifestations and things that have all types of input, whereas there's a being out there who has no beginning and no end. There's a being out there who has divine existence, complete independent existence. There's a being out there who creates everything from that, sort of small ant to that large. So there's a being out there who's full of goodness. He creates this world, this temporal, finite world, and creates it in such a way that it points to him in the most beautiful of ways. The trees point to his name, Al-Razaq, and to his name, Al-Alim. And he's telling you that he's created another realm where there'll be even greater manifestations of his attributes. You go to Jannah and you see even great, whereas here you look at, God's Qudra and you do say, subhanAllah, look how he creates that little ant or the seed that grows into the tree, or that he suspends the sun in space. No, there's other realms where there's even greater signs, that when you see those, you'll even realize how much more powerful he is than you ever thought, how much more knowledgeable and perfect in his knowledge than you ever thought. So that's the most devastating loss, because the Zawiya provides that fertile soil. And then you've got all the other, I think, problems of, ranging from the problems that will happen in the family if a person, doesn't learn patience, all those things, to the problems that will happen in society, if there's people that, are not just and excellent in their dealings, in their management of institutions. Yeah, but I think, definitely knowledge of God and knowing who God is and pursuing God is the most, serious consequence. And then the second one would be more generally the akhlaq that you don't develop, which is so vital to you
knowing God,
but also to having fruitful relationships with his khalq, because if you don't have generosity, you don't have patience, just there's going to be problems in all areas of your life, let alone when you don't have these things, you don't attract the love of other people, good people and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's those two, and then everything else just cascades out of
I
that.
was going to ask you halfway through your answer why you chose the word devastating, but now it's pretty clear why.
Because it is. Like you feel like when the Zawiya, like again, no matter how strong you are, and you might be strong enough that you feel that you're still progressing despite not being part of a Zawiya, despite not having that suhbah. But what even that strong person needs to realize, that if you had that strength and now it was put in the environment of the Zawiya, you're going to fly. Yeah. And that's the potential that they're, because the journey to Allah is infinite. You can never know Allah completely. No one knows him completely. His true perfection, his true beauty, his true majesty. There's just darajat. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the head of the arifin. But we have potential to keep going. And that's why I said the next world is just a continuation of this for the friends of Allah. They're here and they're learning about God. They're knowing God, and they want to go to that other place to see even greater manifestations, and constantly and culminating in the beatific vision. But yeah, definitely that's the one that we would want to remind. But then you've got, like I said, we've touched on this before, other things that will be very difficult without a Zawiya is sort of being able to counter and resist all of the trappings of a materialistic, and having the fact that maybe if we were in a different society, and I've seen these, even smaller size cities, in the Islamic world where there's not as much corruption, there's a lot less fitna, there's a lot less materialistic trappings, and you can sort of function, do your 5 prayers, and there's not those distractions to dirty the heart after having. But in a place like here, where the whole society is built on a materialistic ethic. Everyone is, the primary motivation for being here for most and for everything they're doing is to bring some type of comfort or some type of wealth for themselves or some type of benefit. Everything is built on this pursuit. Where you go to school for almost 12 years and we study in order to get, they've constructed and sequenced and designated subjects that are meant to help us to primarily progress in a career, as opposed to other things that we might
or personal life, for example.
Exactly. So everything is geared. So you need a haven. You need an environment that's sort of going to take you and to sort of tell you, don't forget what you're created for, and don't forget that these things are not goals in themselves, that wealth and all these things are all just meant to be in your hand and not in your heart, and that they're meant to be means to greater ends. So the Zawiya has that capacity to keep in front of you the real order of things, what are means and what are ends, and what are intermediate ends, and what is the ultimate. And that becomes, sort of very important, like I said, in these type of materialistic, where we're really conditioned just to be consumers. That's what, sort of every society sort of has, through the constant messaging, through, like I said, through the education system, through a range, every society has, a certain goal that it's trying to condition people, socialize people into. And here it's just to have that job, to have that career, to have that house. But we would want to sort of say that those aren't the highest goals, and the Zawiya can help to constantly keep that in mind.
I find it, sorry to interrupt, Sidi. I know you wanted to say something.
No, I didn't.
Just on that, like, just yesterday I was driving on the road, Sheikh, and you know how those bus stops have ads on the side? I just had a moment just reflecting on exactly what you said. The ad said, reduce the age of your skin by up to 7 years. And it had like a person face on it, and they were smiling, they looked happy. Like, what's that messaging saying? What are we selling? Or what are we trying to, what kind of society are we creating?
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Like, I only recently, to say the truth, just like as a final example, like, I don't go on Facebook much, so, and I've got an account, and I'm sort of, it's my name, but it's not my full name. But I never looked at reels before. Like, just last week or two, I've been just seeing this phenomenon of reels and like just one thing, short thing, like, cause I don't have Instagram or anything like that. I just got Facebook, but one sort of video after, and it's just like, this is like a ghafla.
People spend hours in that.
Yeah. Like, cause you see it in yourself. You're sort of, okay, what's the next thing and next thing? But like, of course, you've got sort of the poise, you're sort of testing yourself, and you're observing myself and thinking to myself, look at what this thing can potentially create in terms of, people, especially people with not much inside are quite bored. This type of thing fills in at least a vacuum for them where they can, okay, at least it's something that can stimulate me, so you look at these type of things, like, and maybe this is just where it ties in for the younger generation now that are growing up, with these types of things. Like, they need more than ever these types of places and environments that can really be like, look, these things are not the best use of your time, and they're not really taking you anywhere, and that's why we sort of also, even now today, we need Zawiyas that can sort of adapt, that know what's going on the ground and can speak intelligently to people about how to use your devices or how to use this certain platform and at what point it becomes, sort of detrimental.
When you look at the Muslim community today, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, partly what gives me hope is some of the seeds of genuine Islamic community that I can see, alhamdulillah, without doing it consciously. We do have some areas, let's just say, in Melbourne where a sizable population has gathered of Muslims, and where we see, sort of the beginnings of things of a masjid system. We see masjid, and we see madrasas growing, and we see some zawiyas growing. So, I mean, what, sort of does give me some hope is, despite the type of challenges we're faced with, materialist, we do see that Muslims have built something along the lines of Islamic community. So that would be the first thing I'm saying. We've got Muslim populations, they've invested their time, wealth, efforts into building certain institutions. And then on top of that, more recently, I see more positive developments, more people returning from overseas, for example, that could, that are forming local Islamic scholarly classes, which is the most important thing, that we get those individuals back first, because on top of them, we can build education institutions, we can build zawiyas and stuff. So, you've got people returning from overseas, which is a very important virtue formation institution, Islamic scholarly class. You've got elements of the masjid system that weren't there as clearly before, now becoming more accessible. So like your Zawiyas, so for example, Sheikh Abdurrahman's Zawiya in the southeast, and there being attempts, to create maybe other spots across Melbourne. That's also positive, that we've got these spaces that are growing. Because I've seen over the last 20 years, some spaces tried to grow, but then they didn't really take root and flower. But, alhamdulillah, there's certain spaces now that have emerged, and there seems to be a lot of goodwill and people that are involved. So I can see that there's, like I said, there's the seeds. There's also, now a few more Islamic education institutions. Maybe you've got the MMS, but we need still a lot more. So I see what my vision of what an Islamic community needs to have in terms of institutions. I'm seeing those things appear, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done, starting with creating consciousness for me, just about how we need to build these populations further. Because what happens is, just with that challenge of maintaining a dense Muslim population, is sometimes you can have depopulation. Over time, people go to unis, they get they want to move to different suburbs where there's better opportunities for their kids. We understand that, but what we would also say is that there's a community project to build here in these dense populations. The longer we keep these people here, the more they're invested into putting their wealth into local community, the more we can build. So there's these promising seeds, but they need to be maintained. Awareness needs to be created about their importance. They need to continue to be watered. And then hopefully, through other initiatives, a self-consciousness of what we need for Islamic community, and hopefully growing awareness amongst people that maybe we need guilds, or we need more waqfs, or we need this or that. If that awareness can become a part of everyday Muslims understanding not only of what they need in their Islamic community, but of ways in which they can do good. They can donate to build the guild, or they can donate to the, the waqf. Then I think we can sort of continue to see further growth. Yeah, but that's what sort of gives me, hope that we can create spaces that are not only sufficient to maintaining and living our own tradition, but eventually little communities that can be concrete expressions of Islam that non-Muslims can look at. Because dawah will only, and you will only truly see, the effect of Islam and the influx of non-Muslims into Islam when Islam is not something abstract that they just hear, but something that they can actually visit. They can visit these little communities around. And they see these masjid systems, they see this gathering, they see happy families.
Something that seems familiar to their own fitra.
Exactly. Something that they'll immediately also be able to recognize as realizing their own human good. That these are the type of things that I need in my life. And at the end of the day, they are things that are objective. People from all different traditions can recognize and understands the importance of tight-knit families, the importance of purpose, and ordering our life to a higher purpose. But yeah, khair, inshallah. Inshallah, Allah increases the community in good and make things easy and protects, us and our children and our families and our community. And inshallah, we become a light for the wider population, inshallah.